The morning started like every other morning. Cal Whitmore was up before the sun, the way he'd always been, boots on the floor beside the bed, coffee on the stove, the particular silence of early morning that he'd always found more honest than the noise that came later. He'd stood at the window with his cup and watched the sky go from black to grey to the first pale suggestion of colour along the eastern ridge, the way he watched it every morning, the way he'd watched it every morning for the 3 years since Rose had come into his life and made the mornings worth waking up for. He'd set two cups out on the table. He always set two cups out now. He'd called her name once, easy and unhurried, the way you call someone you expect to answer. The sound of it went into the cabin and came back without finding anything to land on. He'd looked in the bedroom. The bed was made, not slept in, made with the careful precision of someone who had done it deliberately rather than just straightened it on the way out. Her side of the wardrobe was open. The blue dress she wore to church was gone. The small leather bag she kept under the bed was gone. He stood there for a long time. He went outside and looked at the road, as if she might still be visible somewhere on it, as if the distance hadn't already swallowed whatever direction she'd chosen. The road was empty. He went back inside and sat at the table and looked at the 2 cups he'd set out and understood, slowly, with the particular brutality of an understanding that arrives without mercy, that one of those cups was never going to be used again. No letter, no word left with a neighbour, no explanation folded into a coat pocket or tucked beneath a candle holder, nothing that said, I was here and now I'm not, beyond the empty wardrobe and the made bed, and the silence that had moved into the cabin like something that intended to stay. Her name was Rose Callahan, and she was gone. And Cal Whitmore stood in the middle of what had been their life and felt the floor shift under him in a way it would never entirely stop shifting, not for 8 years, not until the morning he looked up from his coffee and saw her standing at the edge of his property, like something the past had sent back without warning. But that morning, the first morning, he didn't know any of that yet. He only knew she was gone, and that the silence she'd left behind was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. The town of Millhaven had a version of Cal Whitmore that it had assembled over years and was fairly attached to. In this version, he was a hard man, self-sufficient to the point of indifference, the kind of man who could go a week without speaking to anyone outside of necessary commerce and not notice the absence. He did his work, and he did it well, the land he ran being the most consistently productive in the valley, which was the result of the same relentless and unsentimental application he brought to everything. And he came to town when he needed to and went home when he was done, and nobody knew much about what happened in between. Cold Cowboy, some people called him, not unkindly. Mostly it was a description more than a judgment, the kind of label a community attaches to a man who doesn't give it much to work with. What Millhaven didn't see, because Cal Whitmore had never given it reason to, was the other thing, the way he'd kept, in the 3 years since Rose left, every small thing of hers that remained, a ribbon she'd left on the windowsill, a book she'd been reading with a dried flower pressed inside it, a cup with a small chip in the handle that she'd always used because she said chip things had more character than perfect ones. He hadn't displayed these things. He'd kept them in a wooden box in the back of the wardrobe, in the dark, the way you keep things that are too important to look at every day but too important to let go of, the way he'd ridden out, in the first weeks after she left, in widening circles from Millhaven, asking at every ranch and way station and small settlement whether anyone had seen a woman of her description heading in any particular direction. He'd done this for 2 months before he stopped, not because he'd stopped wanting to find her, but because the geography of her absence was too large, and he was only one man on one horse, the way he'd sat, on winter evenings alone in the cabin that still held the shape of 2 lives, even as it was being lived by one, and looked at the fire with an expression that the people of Millhaven never saw, and wouldn't have described as cold if they had. He was not a cold man. He was a man who had learned at considerable cost, what warmth led to, and had made a quiet, private, entirely understandable decision to stop letting himself want it. That decision had lasted 8 years. It lasted until the morning he looked up and saw her at the edge of his property, and felt something he'd put in a box in the back of a wardrobe crack open in his chest, without asking his permission. *** 8 years is long enough to build a life around an absence. Not a good life, necessarily. Not the life you would have chosen, but a functional one, a life with structure and purpose, and the daily satisfactions of work done well, which are real satisfactions even when they exist in a larger emptiness. Cal had built that life with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, laying it down plank by plank until it was solid enough to stand on, without thinking too carefully about what was underneath. He expanded the ranch, added cattle, then more cattle, then a second-hand named porter who was young and uncomplicated and asked no personal questions, which were Cal's primary criteria for an employee. He fixed the north fence line, rebuilt the barn roof, dug a new well that didn't go dry in summer. He made himself useful to the land, and let the land make him necessary, and in the transaction found something close enough to peace that he'd stopped distinguishing between the two. He did not pursue women. This was noted in Millhaven, as everything was noted, and generated its share of theories. Martha Hale at the diner said he was still carrying a torch. She was right, though she didn't know for whom. Doc Prentice said some men simply weren't built for company. He was wrong, but Cal had given him no evidence to contradict it. The Garber sisters, who were 22 and 24, and between them had expressed interest in Cal on 3 separate occasions through various intermediaries, eventually gave up and directed their attention elsewhere, and Cal noticed their absence with a relief that told him something he preferred not to examine. The question of Rose, where she'd gone, why she'd gone, what had made her leave without a word, had never been answered. Not for him, and not, as far as he could tell, for anyone in Millhaven. She'd had no family in town, no close friends who'd admitted to knowing anything. She'd arrived in Millhaven 2 years before she and Cal found each other, from somewhere east that she'd mentioned rarely and vaguely, with the manner of a woman who had decided that her past was not something she was bringing with her. He had respected that, at the time, had thought it was privacy, which he understood, had thought whatever she was leaving behind was her business, and she'd tell him when she was ready. She'd never been ready, and then she was gone, and the question of why had sat in him for 8 years, like a stone he'd swallowed, present in every quiet moment, heavy in ways he'd learned to work around rather than resolve, unanswerable and unignorable in equal measure. Did she leave by choice? He had wondered 1,000 times. Or was she running from something that gave her no choice? He didn't know. 8 years later, on a morning that started like every other morning, he was finally going to find out. He didn't move. That was the first thing. He simply stood on the porch with the cooling coffee and did not move, because movement would make it real in a way that stillness allowed him to defer. Just for a moment, just for the few seconds it took to be certain he wasn't inventing her out of morning light and 8 years of unresolved wanting. But she was real. She took a step forward, then stopped. She was thinner than he remembered. Not unhealthily so, but the way a person is thin when they've been moving constantly and not resting enough. The leanness of someone in motion, harder than someone at rest. Her hair was the same dark red, pulled back now in a way she hadn't worn it before. She was dressed practically, traveling clothes, worn but well kept, the clothes of someone who had covered a lot of distance and intended to be taken seriously about it. Her face. He had told himself, in the early years, that he was forgetting her face. That memory was unreliable, and the image he carried was already an approximation, a reconstruction rather than a true record. He had told himself this because it was easier than the alternative, which was that he remembered her face exactly and probably always would. He had been telling himself a useful lie. He remembered exactly. She was 34 now. He was 37. The 8 years showed in both of them, and not unkindly, the way time shows in people who have been through things rather than people who have merely passed through time. They were both, he thought in the fraction of a second before everything else took over, older in ways that had more to do with what they'd carried than how long they'd carried it. She said his name, just that, Cal. The 2 letters of it in her voice, after 8 years of silence, did something to him that he had no architecture to manage, no wall built thick enough to absorb without registering. He set the coffee cup down on the porch railing. He walked down the steps. He stopped 10 feet from her, close enough to see her clearly, far enough that he hadn't committed to anything yet, including what expression he was wearing, which he was not entirely sure about. Rose, he said. Her chin came up slightly. That gesture, that exact gesture, the one that meant she was holding herself together by deliberate effort. He had seen it before. He knew what it cost. I know, she said. I know I have no right to be here. He looked at her for a long moment. Come inside, he said. There's coffee. It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of 8 years of pain. It was just coffee, offered to a person standing in the morning cold, which was the smallest possible human gesture. And it was all he could manage right now. And it was, somehow, enough to get them both through the door. Asterisk, asterisk. She held the cup the way she'd always held it, both hands, even when it was warm enough not to need both hands, as if the cup was something to anchor her to the surface of the moment. He sat across from her and waited. He had waited 8 years. He could wait another few minutes. She looked at the table between them, not avoiding his eyes exactly, gathering herself, the way a person gathers themselves before saying something they have rehearsed many times and still don't feel prepared for. My brother, she said. He said nothing. Let her find her way in. You didn't know I had a brother, she said. I never told you. I didn't tell you a lot of things about where I came from, and I'm not going to pretend that was right, because it wasn't. She paused. His name was Daniel. He was 3 years older than me, and he was involved with people, men, who did very bad things, and who had very long memories, and who had decided, at some point before I came to Millhaven, that Daniel owed them something he couldn't pay. She looked up at him. They found him, she said, 2 weeks before I left. He came to me in the night. He'd ridden 3 days to get here, to warn me. He said they were coming. He said they'd use anyone close to me to get to him. He said, she stopped. Her jaw tightened. He said if I stayed, if I had anyone who mattered to me in this town, they would use that person against both of us. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, somewhere distant, a horse moved in the paddock. You mattered to me, Rose said. More than I knew how to say. More than I said. She looked at the cup. So I left. Before they could find you. Before they could use you against him and against me. I left because staying meant putting you in the middle of something that could have gotten you killed. Cal said nothing for a long moment. You could have told me, he said. His voice was level, which was costing him something. I know, she said. I would have. I know what you would have done, she said. And there was something in her voice that was both tender and desperate. That's why I didn't tell you. Because you would have stayed and fought, and you would have been 1 man against 6. And I couldn't. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I couldn't watch that happen. He sat with this. 8 years of a question, answered in 2 minutes over a cup of coffee in a cabin he'd spent 8 years rattling around in alone. The answer was not what he'd imagined, was nothing like any of the versions he'd constructed in his head over the sleepless years. He had imagined she'd stopped loving him. He had imagined someone else. He had imagined, in his darkest hours, that he had simply not been enough, that whatever he'd offered hadn't been sufficient, and she'd gone looking for something better without the courtesy of saying so. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined that she'd left to protect him. Daniel, he said. What happened to him? Something crossed her face that answered the question before she did. He died, she said. 4 years ago. There was nothing left to run from after that. But by then, she looked at her hands. By then, I didn't know if I had any right to come back. If too much time had passed. If you had. She didn't finish. If I'd moved on. Cal said. Yes, she said. He looked at her across the table, at the 8 years in her face, and the exhaustion of whatever road she'd traveled to get back here, and the particular courage it took to stand at the edge of a property left without a word and say a name, and wait to see if the door opened. Why now? He said. She met his eyes. Because I stopped being afraid, she said, and because I needed you to know the truth. Whatever you do with it. She stayed in town, not at the ranch. She took a room at the boarding house, which was the right thing, and she'd done it without being asked, which told him she understood the situation clearly and wasn't presuming anything. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go, which was something she said plainly and without self-pity, and because she had not yet said everything she needed to say, and she thought he had not yet said everything he needed to say either. She was right about that. Cal went home that first evening and sat in the cabin and did something he hadn't done in years, sat without doing anything. No work, no book, no deliberate occupation, just sat and let the thoughts come, which they did, in the disorganized and ungentle way of thoughts that have been held back a long time. He was angry. He discovered this at some depth below the numbness, the way you discover something in a river when the water clears. It had been there all along. He just hadn't been able to see it. He was angry not at what she'd done, but at what she'd decided without him, at the assumption, however loving, however frightened, however understandable, that she had the right to make a choice that was also his to make, to decide, alone, that he needed to be protected, to remove herself from his life on his behalf, without asking him whether that was what he wanted. He was angry about 8 years of not knowing, and he was something else too, something that sat alongside the anger without cancelling it, a quality of understanding that was more painful than anger in some ways, because anger could be maintained and understanding tended to dissolve things you needed to be angry to keep standing. She had been afraid. She had been trying to protect him. She had made a decision out of love that had cost her as much as it cost him, possibly more, because she'd had to live with knowing why, which he had been spared, and knowing why is not always the mercy it sounds like. He understood this. He was still angry. Both things were true, and he was old enough now to know that both things being true was not a contradiction that needed resolving. Some things were just like that. He went to town the next morning, and the morning after that. He didn't seek her out exactly, but Millhaven being what it was, not seeking someone out and not encountering them were not the same thing. He saw her at the diner, eating breakfast alone with a book the way she always had. He saw her in the general store, making small purchases with the careful economy of a woman managing limited funds. He saw her at the edge of town in the late afternoon, standing the way she'd always stood when she was thinking, weight on one foot, looking at the distance. He stopped, one of those afternoons, and stood beside her. They looked at the distance together for a while. I don't know how to do this, he said. Not anger, not warmth, just honesty, which was what he had left when everything else got complicated. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to know. I'm just asking you not to decide yet. He looked at her. How long? He said. She almost smiled. However long it takes. He looked back at the distance. I'm still angry, he said. I know, she said. Good, he said, and walked back toward his horse. But he came back the next afternoon, and the one after that, and Rose Callahan stood at the edge of Millhaven and waited, which was the only thing she could offer, and which was, it turned out, exactly the right thing. It was Porter who moved things forward, which neither Cal nor Rose would have predicted, and both would later find slightly embarrassing. Porter was 23 and had the uncomplicated wisdom of someone who hadn't yet learned to make things complicated. He had been watching the situation unfold with the frank interest of the young, and one evening, when Cal came back from town later than usual, and was quiet in the particular way he'd been quiet for 3 weeks, Porter said, "She seems real sorry, boss." Cal looked at him. "Just saying," Porter said, and went back to what he was doing. Cal went inside. He sat at the table, the same table. The 2 cups he'd set out 8 years ago, still the same cups, which said something about him that he hadn't really examined and thought about what Porter had said, with the simple directness that simple things sometimes cut through what complicated ones can't reach. She seemed real sorry. She was. He knew she was. He had seen it in every conversation, every afternoon at the edge of town, every careful and unpresumptuous action she'd taken since arriving, the room at the boarding house, the not asking, the waiting. He had seen it, and he had let himself be moved by it in the private part of him that he still hadn't opened to her, because opening it meant something, and he wasn't sure yet what. He rode into town the next morning earlier than usual. That she was on the porch of the boarding house with her coffee, in the early light, and she looked up when she heard his horse, and her face did the thing it had always done when she saw him, a quality of opening, like a window, that she had never entirely learned to control, and that he had always loved about her. He dismounted. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "I have a question," he said. She waited. "If I'd known," he said. "If you'd come to me that night and told me what your brother told you, what was coming, what you were afraid of, if you'd asked me to make the choice with you instead of making it for me," he paused, "what did you think I would have said?" She looked at him. "I thought you would have said to stay," she said quietly, "and fight. And was I wrong?" he said, "to want that choice?" "No," she said, "you weren't wrong. I was afraid, and I made a decision out of fear, and it cost us both 8 years. I can't give those back. I can only tell you that if I could do it over, I would have come to you. I would have been afraid, and I would have come to you anyway and let you decide." He stood there for a moment. "There's a section of fence on the north pasture that needs another pair of hands," he said. "If you're not busy this morning." She stared at him. "Fence," she said. "It's not a small job," he said. "Take most of the day." He saw her understand what he was offering. Not forgiveness complete and declared. Not a return to what was, but a morning of work side by side on a piece of land that was his, which was the closest thing he knew to an invitation. She set down her cup and stood up. "Let me get my boots," she said. They worked the fence together through the morning and into the afternoon, and they talked, not about the 8 years, not yet, but about other things, smaller things, the way people talk when they are finding out whether the ease they once had with each other is still there, or whether time has taken it. It was still there. Changed, deepened, freighted with everything that had happened, but still there, like bedrock that the surface had shifted over, but that the shifting hadn't touched. By the time the light went gold and long, they were sitting on the top rail of the finished fence, looking out over the north pasture, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind rather than the hollow kind. And Cal thought that this, right here, this specific moment, was what he had been without for 8 years. Not the romance, not the history, not even the love exactly, just this, another person beside him in the world, who made the world feel like less of an empty place. He looked at her. She was looking at the pasture with the particular expression of someone who is trying to memorize a moment while it's still happening. "Rose," he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else for a moment. "Don't go again," he said. Her eyes filled. She didn't look away, didn't hide it, let him see it, which was its own kind of answer. "I won't," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not the kind of moment that announces itself. It was just a people on a fence rail in the late afternoon light, and a promise made quietly in the direction of the future rather than the past, which was, after 8 years of the past, exactly the right direction to make a promise in. She didn't move into the ranch. Not immediately. And this was her insistence, not his, which surprised him, and then didn't. She had spent 8 years on her own terms, making her own decisions, living with the consequences of them, and the person she was now was not someone who was going to fold herself into another person's life without being deliberate about it. She had her room at the boarding house. She had found work with Clara Beggs at the Mercantile, who had taken her on with the matter-of-fact practicality of a woman who needed capable help, and had found it. She was building something, and he understood, because he had built something himself in difficult circumstances, that you don't interrupt a person building something just because you want them closer. He came to town most days. She came to the ranch on Sundays, and they had dinner at the table with the 2 cups that he still set out, which she noticed and said nothing about, which was the right response. And they talked, really talked, in the way they hadn't talked 8 years ago, when they'd both been keeping things back. He told her about the 2 months of riding in search of her. He said it plainly, without dramatics, as a fact of what had happened. She listened without looking away, which also cost her something, and which she appreciated. She told him about the years after, where she'd gone, what she'd done, the particular loneliness of a life lived in motion without destination. She had worked in 3 different towns, under different names in the early years, when she was still afraid, making herself small and unremarkable, the opposite of everything she'd been with him. She had been safe. She had been miserable in a low, sustainable way that had eventually started to feel so normal she'd stopped noticing it. "When did you stop being afraid?" he asked one Sunday evening, the dishes done, the fire burning low. She thought about it. "Slowly," she said, and then all at once. The way things end sometimes. He understood that. Millhaven, for its part, received Rose Callahan's return with the complex mixed response of a town that had opinions about everything and had been denied the satisfaction of knowing the full story for 8 years. There was gossip. There was always gossip. And there was judgment. And there was also, beneath both, a grudging romantic investment in the outcome that the town would not have admitted to, but that expressed itself in small ways. Martha Hale at the diner gave Rose slightly larger portions than she charged for. Doc Prentice revised his theory about Cal being built for company. The Garber sisters, to their credit, took the situation with more grace than could reasonably have been expected. Porter said nothing about any of it, which remained his greatest contribution. In the spring, 7 months after Rose had stood at the edge of his property in the morning light, Cal rode into town on a Sunday morning earlier than usual, which Porter noted and filed away for a future reference. He went to the boarding house. Rose came to the door with flour on her hands, which meant she'd been baking, which she did when she was content, which he had reasoned about her over the preceding months. He had something in his hand, small, something he'd found in a box in the back of a wardrobe, where he'd kept the things that were too important to look at every day, but too important to let go of. A ring, plain gold, sized for her finger, that he'd bought in the first year they were together and had never found the right moment to produce and had stopped thinking he would. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to give anything up," he said. "Your work, your room here until you're ready, your own decisions. I'm not asking for any of that to change before you're ready for it to change." He paused. "I'm just asking if you'll marry me, in whatever time and in whatever way makes sense to you. I'm not in a hurry." She looked at him for a long moment, at the ring, at his face, at the ring again. "You kept it," she said. "Yes," he said. She reached out and took it from his hand. She looked at it lying in her palm, a small plain thing that had waited in the dark for 8 years, the same way he had, which was not a coincidence. She put it on. She looked up at him. "I'm not in a hurry either," she said. "But yes," he almost smiled, which in Millhaven, for a man with Cal Whitmore's reputation, was practically a celebration. She reached up and put her flour-dusted hand against his face, briefly, the way you touched something you couldn't believe you still had. He put his hand over hers. They stood there in the doorway of the boarding house in the spring morning, and the town of Millhaven went about its business around them, and nobody who saw them would have called the man in that doorway a cold cowboy. Not anymore. Not ever again. Some hearts don't stop waiting, even when they've learned to be quiet about it, even when the waiting seems unreasonable and the hope seems foolish and the years pile up and the road stays empty. They wait because the alternative, giving that person up entirely, closing the door completely, deciding that what was between you was not worth the weight of an open question, is simply not something they are able to do. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the road stops being empty, and the person standing at the end of it turns out to have been carrying the same weight, and the years between don't disappear, but they become, somehow, part of the story rather than the end of it. That is what love looks like when it survives, not perfect, not undamaged, but still there. Still there. If this emotional cowboy story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Would you forgive someone who disappeared 4 years without an explanation? Don't forget to like, subscribe to Broken Spur Stories, and turn on notifications for more Western redemption stories filled with love, loss, forgiveness, and second chances.